Thank you all again for joining us today for our MDA Advocacy Institute on Accessible Air Travel. I am Paul Melmeyer. I am MDA's Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy, and I'm going to be your moderator for much of our agenda today. So let's move on to the next slide to talk about who we are. I already introduced myself, but I want to also introduce you to our really fantastic panel we have here today to discuss accessible air travel with you all. First, I want to introduce you to Heather Ansley. Heather is the Associate Executive Director of Government Relations at the Paralyzed Veterans of America, one of MDA's best and closest partners on this issue. So we're really thrilled to have Heather representing Paralyzed Veterans of America here today with us. We also have Dr. Chris Rosa. He is, of course, a member of the Muscular Dystrophy Association's Board of Directors, but he's also the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Inclusion Initiatives at the City University of New York. And then finally, we're thrilled to have Meghan Ladwig, who's a Director of Appropriations and a Senior Policy Advisor for Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. So let's move on to talk a little bit how this hour is going to look today. So first, we're going to start with a conversation with Meghan at the office of Senator Baldwin, talking about Senator Baldwin's work in accessible air travel and some of the current legislation that Senator Baldwin has introduced that is, of course, specifically focused on this very issue. From there, we're going to move into a discussion with Dr. Rosa and with Heather on the background of accessible air travel, how it's regulated, how it's evolved over the years, how you all can get involved in trying to make travel more accessible. And then finally, we will finish up with questions, your questions. So throughout the hour, please feel free to put a question into the Q&A box. You can see it down there at the bottom of your screen. If it is, of course, topical, if it's germane to our conversation, we'll absolutely want to get there and answer that question that you may have. And we may also answer them as we go along, but we'll also have a time reserved at the end of our hour to answer any of your questions on accessible air travel. But for now, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Chris Rosa. He is going to be talking with Meghan on Senator Tammy Baldwin's excellent work in this space. Chris, take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm so pleased to welcome, again, Director of Appropriations and Senior Policy Advisor, Meghan Ladwig. Meghan brings more than a decade of progressively responsible leadership and policy development experience as a staff member on Capitol Hill. Meghan, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that welcome.
Thank you. Meghan, could you please tell us about the Air Carriers Access Act Amendments Act, and from your perspective, the difference it would make for individuals whose disabilities affect their mobility in air travel?
Sure. I would say, there really are many pieces to this bill, but they're all of the pieces in this legislation are designed to protect the rights of air passengers with disabilities, to improve air travel safety, and close the service gaps that passengers with disabilities encounter in air travel all too often. They were too often when we proposed the bill more than a few years ago now, and of course are still happening today. And that means stronger enforcement of existing laws and some new proposals that we'd like to see move forward this year. I can talk about any of those pieces later, but that's really the broad strokes.
Great, and we are excited to hear about those new proposals. To have Senator Baldwin to champion this legislation. Knowing Senator Baldwin as you do, could you please offer some insight on what inspired her to lead on this issue?
Sure, I would say, like our best pieces of legislation, this one was inspired by a constituent story. It really came from a meeting with constituents that helped give life to why such legislation would be needed. Over the years, we've heard many more stories that continue to underscore for us and for the senator why the reforms in the bill are so needed. So it really came from that meeting with constituents.
It's so heartening to see that the significant piece of policy emanated from her close connection to the lives of those people she represents, lives of people like us. Senator Baldwin has recently reintroduced the ACAAA in this session of Congress. From your perspective, what's the plan to get this legislation enacted?
Sure, and I just to build off a little bit about that last question and to move it into this one, the MDA and PVA have been so helpful in making it very easy for us to not only introduce the legislation, but then also to make sure that it's relevant to the conversations that we're having currently on Capitol Hill. And so as far as moving this legislation forward, the bill has been reintroduced. We have a strong list of co-sponsors as we have in the past. And at this point, we are having conversations with relevant committees as they work to put legislative text to these bold infrastructure plans that we're all hearing about. The president and the new administration came in with a big goal about what infrastructure means, and we believe that this kind of package of reforms and this legislation really has a place within all of those conversations as we talk about infrastructure outside of roads and bridges, knowing that there's so much that we need to do to make sure that everybody has a chance to enjoy infrastructure, structures, roads and bridges, but then also air travel. So for this, it's very relevant to those conversations.
No, we appreciate it, and I'm not used to thinking about air travel in terms of infrastructure, but as you referenced, we do have a new president who has publicly voiced his support for the disability community, including advancing a disability policy platform. How can we all work with the administration to advance these priorities?
I think it is continuing to talk about it in any conversations that you as a group or as individuals are having with FAA, the DOT secretary, making sure that it's on their radars to make sure that we're connecting the dots between what they're hearing from the co-sponsors of this legislation and the need for it. Senator Baldwin has raised this bill with all of the relevant nominees at DOT and will be doing so at FAA as they come before her, looking for that approval for their new jobs to make sure that they know, when the president talks about enforcement of existing regulations on air travel, here's what we mean and how we can move forward in that conversation. So really just making sure that we're continuing to talk about it, continuing to elevate it, and making it part of those infrastructure conversations. And, depending on how that turns out, whether or not it's able to ride along with any infrastructure package, we will certainly look for any and all avenues to move this legislation forward, recognizing that it's a bill that has been referred to a committee that we sit on, and we would be very happy to move through regular order.
That's great. And I appreciate you talking about the importance of keeping these conversations alive in the minds and hearts of those who represent us in Congress. What message would you have for the community of advocates gathered here today on how we can all help to advance this agenda?
I would say to recognize that you would be talking with somebody who are very frequently members of the traveling public, to know that these are people who are in an airplane every week in a usual year. And so making sure that your stories of air travel or avoidance of air travel in a lot of cases would disrupt their lives if they had to deal with any of the number of just hurdles that come across when you're traveling with a disability. And so sharing those stories, making sure that you're sharing that expertise that you have with your members of Congress, was the basis of this legislation and could be the thing that tips somebody's co-sponsorship or attention to the legislation if they're interested in joining our coalition here. And I would say that includes members of the Senate, but it also includes members of the House of Representatives. We have a very strong duo in the House that has moved forward with a companion piece of legislation, and I'm sure would be very excited to have any new co-sponsors of their bill as well.
Meghan, thank you for that insight, and thank you in particular for validating the voices and the lived experiences with air travel of people with neuromuscular disabilities and with Americans with disabilities in general. And on behalf of all of us, thank you, and please thank Senator Baldwin for her advocacy to make air travel more accessible for all of us. Thank you.
Oh, I absolutely will. And I know that she wanted to be here with all of you today, but I am here in her stead and will carry the message.
We appreciate you, and we very much appreciate her leadership. Thank you. Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rosa, and thank you again, Meghan. And we'll hope to come back to some of these topics and perhaps additional questions for Meghan on these topics at the end of the webinar. But for now, I want to move into a conversation with Dr. Rosa and with Heather. You know, we kind of started in a sense with the solution. We talked a lot about the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, a bill in Congress right now that could make such a huge difference for the community. And again, thank you to Meghan and thank you to Senator Baldwin for leading on this. Let's talk about why we're doing this in the very first place. And Dr. Rosa, I really want to start with you on this because let's start with the experiences of someone with a disability trying to travel by plane. What are some of the common experiences or challenges of someone with a disability when traveling by air? And just how common are these experiences in the community?
Well, Paul, thank you. I serve on MDA's board as the representative of the families that MDA serves. And so I'm really proud that our advocacy program always tries to take the pulse on issues that are most critical to people in our community who are living and thriving with neuromuscular diseases. And we got really good data from a pulse survey that was drawn about 2 years ago about air travel among families served by MDA. And prior to the pandemic, roughly 80% of people with neuromuscular disabilities that MDA serves engaged in air travel. A sobering 70% of those individuals reported experience with significant barriers to air travel that limited access and travel opportunities. These difficulties are particularly prominent, as all of us might imagine, for power wheelchair and scooter users. A whopping 40% of people with neuromuscular diseases surveyed indicated that they had experienced damage to power chairs during flights, our worst nightmare. And when you consider this figure, this is really a staggering amount of damage and disruption to the lives of people with disabilities. There's been a significant increase in damage incidents reported by passengers with disabilities to airlines, so much so that repairs, replacement, reimbursement have now been routinized by the airline industry, which on the one hand is a good thing, right, in terms of repair and restitution, but on the other hand, it's a chilling admission by the airline industry that it is simply just accepted that power wheelchair damage is an inevitable fixed cost that is a routine feature of the industry's business model. We continue to have difficulties, as everybody on this webinar knows, with third-party contractors hired by airlines who assist with boarding and deplaning. These companies are invariably staffed by certainly well-intentioned, but low-wage, low-skill workers, and there's tremendous staff turnover at these firms, resulting in staff that are perpetually on the upward slope of a steep learning curve, while their training is certainly improved over the years, they're trained to do things one way and one way only. And they're not always prepared to follow the lead of people with disabilities who are more self-directed in addressing their transfer, seating, and positioning needs. Laboratories are woefully inaccessible, so I make sure to get all my drinking done before I get on board. And most flights don't keep an in-flight aisle chair on board as a matter of course. You have to ask for that in advance. In a typical year, I fly once a month for work, either my own work at the City University of New York or my work with MDA or other nonprofit boards. When possible, I prefer to fly independently on my own. And in a few instances, I've been denied access to a flight simply because I didn't meet the DOT standards for independent travel, meaning that I didn't demonstrate that I could evacuate independently in an event of an emergency, which, as you might imagine, and for those who have experienced it, is experienced as a little demeaning and degrading. finally, despite some progress over 25 years of the ACAA, the prevailing sense remains, the act notwithstanding, that when you fly as a person with a disability, along with your baggage, in many respects, you feel as though you're also checking your civil rights at the curb.
Wow, well, thank you, Dr. Rosa. I mean, each and every one of those experiences, not only that you have had, but individuals in the community have unfortunately too widely have had, really are quite resonates and are really important to instructor conversation. Heather, I want to go to you to talk about why we find ourselves in this current situation, or more specifically, why Dr. Rosa and other individuals with disabilities find themselves in these situations. So after hearing these experiences, tell us about what policies and procedures govern this whole system. Dr. Rosa talked a little bit about the ACAA, but tell us how we got here. Tell us where we've been and then where we are today with what governs this system.
Well, thanks, Paul. It's wonderful to be with everyone today. And so dismaying and unfortunately common to hear the experience from Dr. Rosa for many passengers with disabilities who try to access air travel. So to go back in time, if you will, 35 years ago, Congress passed a law called the Air Carrier Access Act. And precipitating that law was actually a case that Paralyzed Veterans of America, my organization, took all the way to the Supreme Court to try to get access to the then existing laws, which was primarily the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which stated that federal funding, or if it goes into a facility, or if it is federal funding, federal in nature, that there are disability access laws. Of course, this all predates the Americans with Disabilities Act. And although a lot of money goes into air travel, and certainly we've seen that even in the last year, the court said unless a specific airline gets federal funding, you're not going to get protections under 504. So in pretty short order, the Air Carrier Access Act was passed. Then Senator Bob Dole was one of the leaders that helped to get this through. And the Air Carrier Access Act is a very short, simple law that basically says, you can't discriminate against people with disabilities in air travel, defines disability, and then includes some reporting requirements and things like that. But the vast majority of the protections provided by the law are in the regulations that were developed in 1990 following a negotiated rulemaking between airlines and disability stakeholders that ultimately ended in a stalemate, but led the department to be able to move forward with passing those regs. And it was really this law and these regulations that did provide a measure of consistency to passengers. Before 1986, you could show up with your ticket ready to go, and unfortunately an experience similar to what Dr. Rosa mentioned, you might be denied boarding simply because you have a disability, and it wasn't illegal for them to do that, which is really difficult to even think about, but that's where we were. So now this law covers all domestic or U.S. airlines on all their flights. That was the initial ad. And then later on, they added foreign air carriers that are traveling to or from the U.S. So if there's a U.S. takeoff or landing, air carrier applies. And basically this says, that airlines must give passengers with disabilities additional time to board if requested. They must provide guide assistance to get to the gate. That includes, making sure that if you've got a connecting flight, you get from where you've landed to where you now need to take off from. And that assistance, as Dr. Rosa mentioned, is many times provided by contract service providers that contract with airlines to do that. Airlines are also required to give prompt assistance if you request it in boarding and deplaning, including providing personnel, the dreaded aisle chair to get on and off the aircraft, providing motorized carts, ramps, depending on the nature of your disability. Air carriers are also required to stow manual power wheelchairs And if they do damage those devices, which unfortunately that does occur many times, the baggage limits. So if they damage your baggage, there are limits that apply to how much you can get back. That's not the case if they damage your assistive device. If you have a manual chair or crutches or canes or walkers, something that possibly could be stored in the cabin, you do have the right to be able to stow that in the closet, although many do not have onboard closets anymore. And also seating accommodations. You're supposed to be given a seat that meets your disability-related needs, but only within your class of service. This is something that's become more of an issue as the cabin has become more monetized. So if we think back to when there was maybe a first class and a coach, now we have first class and business and comfort plus and all of these various pieces, and they all come with extra dollar signs when you're buying that ticket. And so sometimes DOT determines that particular seats are a different class of service, meaning that the airline doesn't have to accommodate me in that seat if I didn't buy that ticket. So there are a lot of things that have developed in the last 35 years that, quite frankly, in some respects have made the cabin less accessible to people with disabilities, as more and more people are now being crammed into a smaller space. You have to pay more money if you want a better seat, a closer seat to the front, so you don't have to get pulled back all the way through the aircraft to your seat. And what we find is that, despite the protections I went over, despite the things that are required, as Dr. Rosa mentioned, and I can attest, I would say I could practically throw a stone and find a PBA member who's had a problem with air travel, because it's just so pervasive. Whether it's difficulties navigating TSA, contractors who aren't properly trained, broken wheelchairs, inaccessible lavatories, the list just goes on and on and on.
Well, thank you, Heather. I mean, that was an excellent overview of, the initial beginnings of all of this journey, which was the passage of the Air Carrier Access Act back in 1986, how it has evolved since then, and then, of course, the problems that still remain, despite the fact that the Air Carrier Access Act was introduced and passed in 1986. The elephant in the room, in a sense, for all of this, and I want to thank Stephen for the question and the comments in the Q&A pertaining to the Americans with Disabilities Act. You talked about the ACAA, but you didn't mention, at least I didn't hear you mention the ADA. Why doesn't the ADA apply to air travel?
So that's a good question, Paul. And the Air Carrier Access Act passed in '86, and as I said, the regulations, which are really the heart of it, came out in 1990. That, of course, 1990 is also when we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And at that time, I think there was really a view that, we had kind of dealt with air travel through this separate law. It was just beginning to take off. And that, quite frankly, we didn't need to fight that battle within the ADA to get the airlines to agree to all the stuff that we were putting in there, that we had air carrier, and we could, that would solve that issue, or at least make it better. And the ADA, it's important to note, in the statute explicitly does not apply to commercial air travel. So when you look at the section that involves the definition of public transportation, and I think many of us, if we were not thinking of a legal definition, but just thinking of more of a common sense definition, air travel is a lot like riding on the city bus or on a metro. It's a bunch of people who bought tickets all going to the same place, driven by either a computer or a person or somebody else who's getting us there. But in that definition, it explicitly excludes transportation by aircraft. So it's important to note that when we're dealing with the mechanism of the air travel, ADA does not apply. I do want to note, however, that the airport is a different story. So the airport is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's going to be either Title II if it's a state or local entity. There are some private airports, those would be covered under Title III. And in addition, airports get a lot of federal money, which means you're also most likely looking at Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So airports are covered by the ADA. When you get to TSA, because that's a federal entity, Section 504 of the Rehab Act covers you. Then when you get to the actual getting on the aircraft, you're dealing with the Air Carrier Access Act. So I always like to say the airport and air travel it's a menagerie of different disability rights civil laws that get you to and fro once you enter the airport. And it really does make a huge difference. As we've seen now, we've had this year to be 31 years since we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And quite frankly, we've seen how transportation has evolved with access versus air travel, and it's become quite stark, which is quite frankly why we're seeking changes.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Heather. That's a great background there. Chris, I want to bring it back to you because you talked about some of the experiences that you and others have had within the disability community of challenges in air travel, but really it is broader than that. Let's talk about even the broader implications of all of this. What are some of the activities that are limited due to the difficulty of traveling by air? Could it inhibit an individual in trying to participate in a clinical trial, for example, or if traveling for work, and thus it can have implications on an individual's employment, or other travel that individuals without disabilities perhaps take for granted, but are really integral for those in the disabilities community that difficulty traveling by air can really pose challenges for.
Paul, thank you. And you're absolutely correct. The inaccessibility of air travel impacts us in key aspects of American life, so many key aspects of American life. Prior to the pandemic, the tourism industry reported that travelers with disabilities spend some $58 billion annually on travel. And while this is a big number, it's only a fraction of what Americans with disabilities would spend if our opportunities weren't limited by the inaccessibility of air travel. In terms of employment, and you referenced employment opportunity, in a truly global economy, the expectation for many jobs now is that people will travel for work, especially at the more senior and executive levels. The inaccessibility of air travel not only limits employment opportunities for people with disabilities in this way, but it also contributes to other dynamics which help to create a glass ceiling for leadership opportunities for people with disabilities. It also limits the participation, as you alluded to, something that's very close to the heart of MDA's mission. It limits participation in clinical trials at a pivotal moment in our history. MDA-sponsored research has helped to give rise to a real watershed moment where we are now experiencing more promising clinical trials than at any point in our history, thanks to our network of care centers and the Mover Patient Registry. We're also now better positioned than ever to connect families with clinical trials around the country and to have them participate in therapies in real time. However, in a very real sense, the promise of clinical trials can only be fulfilled if people with neuromuscular diseases are able to travel to sites at which these trials are conducted. So Paul, it's just a small sense of the many ways in which limited access to air travel impacts the lives of people with neuromuscular disabilities.
Thank you, Dr. Rosa. That really is an excellent explanation of if you pull the thread of just the challenges that exist on the airplane or getting on the airplane or getting off the airplane. It really is much, much, much more broad than that, than just anything limited towards to specifically traveling by air, just to all the other limitations that it can bring. Just a quick reminder, thank you to everyone who has submitted questions in the Q&A box. Stephen, Sandra, Diane, we're going to get to your questions. Thank you so much. An invitation again to everybody else. If you have a question for our panel here, please do submit it in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to those by the end of our hour together. Heather, I do want to turn it back to you. We have a good idea now of all the challenges that exist for those with disabilities in traveling by air. And so what is there to be done about this? And let's start with the administration. Let's start with regulatory interventions. What options does the Biden administration have to tackle some of these issues? And do you foresee them actually doing so?
Well, thank you for that question, Paul. Certainly, since you mentioned regulations, there are several regulations that are pending that we're hoping the Department of Transportation will act on. That includes what would be a requirement for an accessible restroom on a single aisle aircraft, which right now there are some airlines that do have some accessibility, but it's not required, and it's very, very minimal, those that do have it. Back in 2016, the members of the disability community, airlines, airplane manufacturers got together, worked with the Department of Transportation, and came up, participated in what's called negotiated rulemaking. So basically, we all got together in a lot of hotel ballrooms over months and weeks and developed a proposal. And we came to an agreement for a long-term view that would mean eventually an accessible restroom on a single aisle aircraft. At the time, 18 years went from an order of an aircraft or 20 years from delivery. Again, long timelines, but aircraft have long lives, about 25 years standard. So we said it's better to have a marker in the sand, and eventually we'll get to a place where we have an accessible restroom, especially if we all agree. Well, unfortunately, the Department of Transportation has failed thus far to finalize some of the short-term solutions we came up with, which quite frankly won't be of much help, for instance, to many PVA members who exclusively use wheelchairs for their mobility. They did put out what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, where they said, here's what we're thinking, asking the public what they think. That was about a year ago. They collected those comments. The second piece, which is that long-term solution of how do we get a truly accessible restroom on a single aisle aircraft, they have yet to put out. Unfortunately, we're nearing year 5 from when that was discussed. So that's certainly something they can do. There are also some other regulations pending, including accessible in-flight entertainment, looking at priority, what does it mean to get prompt service, and some other pieces. There's also the possibility of tighter enforcement. Right now, enforcement of this law is on DOT. It's pretty much their issue. You can't go to court. Department of Justice doesn't get involved. It's just DOT. So they could levy more penalties. They could do more, reviews of airlines to try to get them more on board with accessibility. They could develop more training materials, which they've done in the past. I don't know if they've looked to see how airlines have incorporated those and whether or not that's made a difference. We also have the Air Carrier Access Act Advisory Committee. And this was a federal advisory committee that was required under the FAA reauthorization of 2018. And it's an advisory committee that was set up to advise the secretary specifically on air travel of people with disabilities, and includes individuals from a variety of disability organizations, including myself. I know MDA has a representative, as well as representatives from wheelchair manufacturers and from airlines, to really try to work together and figure out what solutions we can come up with to better meet the air travel needs of people with disabilities. So certainly there are some things that the administration can do in what I'll call more the short term.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, certainly a lot that the Biden administration could undertake. The Department of Transportation, DOT, could undertake. Lots of opportunity there to make a real difference in the lives of many people. But let's return to how we started the conversation today, which is the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. And so since we know there's lots that the Biden administration can do, but there's also lots that the Biden administration may not be able to do that does require legislative intervention. Tell us about the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, the very same bill that Senator Tammy Baldwin has introduced, that Meghan has been a leader on. And unfortunately, Meghan did have to drop off. Congress is in session right now. You never know when staffers have to run to something. So Meghan had to run. But Heather, let's talk about Meghan's bill. Let's talk about Senator Tammy Baldwin's bill, the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act.
Sure, thanks, Paul. So as we know, many of the barriers that members, of the disability community face are not really addressed by the Air Carrier Access Act or are regulated by the Department of Transportation, particularly when you look at what's required under the ADA. There's also no private right of action. That basically means I can't go to court, file a suit, and say you violated my rights under the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act, because Congress has never given that authority. So there's very little redress of grievances. Basically, you can file a claim with the airline, and they are required to fix your wheelchair. But if there's not damage per se to your device, or if you don't have some type of injury that might lead to a claim, that you could file in state court for your injuries, your damages, you're really left with, they might give you some money for another ticket, or they might, give you travel miles, but it's nothing that's really going to solve the issue. And quite frankly, it's very insignificant compared with the dignity issues that many people face. And the other opportunity is to file a complaint with the Department of Transportation. And, if you've tried to file one of those complaints, I know I have files full of them from PVA members. Even when it's found that your rights were violated, here's the section of the law, here's what they did. It says at the end, basically, well, we're going to send them a copy of this letter. And if we decide this is a pattern or practice, meaning we see it happening all the time, maybe we'll fine them, but otherwise, kind of good luck. And a lot of our folks, when I speak for PBA, they won't even file the complaints anymore because they feel like, I have other things to do, nothing ever changes, why bother? So we believe, and as do MDA, many other disability organizations, and thankfully some of our champions in Congress, that to improve access, we really need to pass legislation that would amend this law. So on our next slide, we have some information about that. So Senator Tammy Baldwin, which you heard from her staff, Meghan Ladwig earlier, on the Senate side, and then on the House side, Representative Jim Langevin, who is out of Rhode Island, in early March introduced the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, which is HR 1696 and S 642. And this legislation would, number one, it would establish that private right of action so that you could have the ability to go to court if your rights are violated under this law. The Americans with Disabilities Act includes a private right of action, as do many other civil rights laws, but this law does not. It would also increase administration enforcement to try to get the Department of Transportation to be a little more, how do I say this, decisive in its decision to regulate the airlines on this issue and to, impose penalties and to really make the seriousness of this known. The fact that we have a group of people in our country who will not travel, many of them by air, because they have either been injured, they know people who have been injured, or they're afraid of being injured. That's really egregious and something that we want to see change. This would also, the legislation would also establish a set of physical standards of access that new airplanes would have to meet. And this is where, if you were to take a look at the legislation, you would see similarities to the Americans with Disabilities Act, because in helping to draft this legislation, we really said we don't want to open up the Americans with Disabilities Act for a variety of reasons, but the Air Carrier Access Act law isn't really working for us. So why don't we bring some of its requirements over into the Air Carrier Access Act? And that's where we have a requirement that's in the legislation where the United States Access Board, which develops standards for other modes of transportation, would now have a role here in developing standards for wheelchair and other access. So cross-disability access to air travel. And then it would require airlines, just like we have under the Americans with Disabilities Act, to remove access barriers on existing aircraft if readily achievable. So basically, if I could break these two down, what this means is in the hopes that we could get something like this passed, we know that we're going to have to say standards apply on future aircraft. But the aircraft you already have, we know we're not going to just take them out of service and make all of these major changes. However, the aircraft you already have, there are changes that you could make airline that would make travel more accessible for people with disabilities, and you should do that when you can. So this is part of this is not a quick fix or an easy fix. This is basically busting the system and saying what we have right now doesn't work and we need a new paradigm, and we understand it's going to take us a little bit of time to get there. So thankfully, in addition to Senators Baldwin and Representative Langevin, we have other senators and representatives who have signed on to the legislation in the 117th Congress. So on our next slide, we have a list of those individuals. So you'll see in the Senate, we have Senators Casey, Senator Blumenthal, Markey, Merkley, Duckworth, and Hassan, who have once again signed on. They were supporters of the bill in the previous Congress. They're back to give their support. Many of them have connections to the Commerce Committee or to the disability community, and have been very good at showing their support for these efforts. On the House side, again, Representative Langevin has been our sponsor over there, and returning for another year, we have Representative Titus and Representative Cohen, who were original co-sponsors, and importantly, they're on the House Transportation Committee. Unfortunately, Mr. Langevin is not. And then recently, we've added Mr. Cleaver out of Missouri, which was a great addition. I know one of our PBA members met with his office when we had our virtual fly-in a few weeks ago, so we hope that helped convince him to get on, but regardless, he is on board now as well. So we have several folks who are on, and we are really working hard to try to get not only those, particularly in the House, that sponsored the legislation in the previous year, but also try to get new co-sponsors to join. And I will note that the version of this bill from the 116th Congress, which is substantially the same as what has been reintroduced this year, was part of the disability platform of then candidate President Biden. So he had signaled that if he were to become president, that this legislation was something that he felt was important, that it become law to increase equity for passengers with disabilities. So we are letting everyone know that that the bill is here, that this is an equity issue, and that we really do need everyone on board to get this change made.
Thank you, Heather. That's an excellent summary of the legislation, where it stands now, who's supporting it. And then Chris, I just have one final question for you before we get to some of the fantastic questions in the Q&A box. And again, thank you everybody for sending in your questions. We're going to get to them after this final one for Dr. Rosa. And Dr. Rosa, I wanted to ask you this. The neuromuscular disease advocacy community is really a force to be reckoned with. They have accomplished so much change over the years. And I want you to tell us a little bit about how the community has successfully advocated for policies, for bills, for other changes to laws in the past. And now that we know about this opportunity here in front of us to support this legislation in Congress, what advice would you have for the advocates on our webinar today who may not be familiar or comfortable with sharing their story of challenges with aircraft travel, with other related challenges in advancing this piece of legislation? What would you say to them?
Great. So thanks, Paul. And in terms of situating our efforts around the Air Carriers Access Amendment Act within the arc of advocacy, our history of advocacy within the neuromuscular disease movement, thanks to MDA's advocacy program in coalition with a lot of very important organizations in this space, I've been truly blessed to be able to participate in some really historic moments in our neuromuscular disease movement. I was fortunate enough with other great leaders on this call to advocate for the MD Care Act, which established, among other things, the MDA Coordinating Committee that coordinates activities across the National Institutes and other federal health programs related to various types of muscular dystrophy. And through the act, we've really changed the landscape for research and care for people with muscular dystrophy. Together, we were able to fight for the passage of the ALS Disability Insurance Access Act, which eliminated the 5-month waiting period for SSDI so that people living with ALS can get the support that they need immediately. We've also advocated consistently for greater funding for neuromuscular disease research and newborn screening through the NIH and other federal agencies. And we've made a lot of progress on that front. And finally, we advocated for, which was really an important achievement, for the passage of GINA, which prevents genetic discrimination in both health insurance and employment. In terms of what we can all do to make a difference in all of these areas, but particularly in advocacy for the Air Carriers Access Amendment Act, I urge everyone to remember that all politics is local, and that we should all take the time to get to know our elected representatives and their staff members in our district. We should also demonstrate our interest and advocacy on other issues that are important to those elected representatives to show them that we are truly fully engaged as constituents. And invite them to participate in local MDA events. They can be inspired by our mission and demonstrate that MDA is really comprised of a large network of volunteers and allies that live in their district. And it helps us to make sure that we retain their attention. Not everyone is comfortable telling their story, but in a movement, there's a role for everyone. I know that a lot of people who are much younger than me are much more savvy around digital and social media, and leveraging social media right now to get the word out about an important advocacy initiative is critical in not only spreading the word and cultivating a movement, but it's been my experience now that staffers of elected representatives look at digital impressions to get a sense of how important this is to how many people who live in their district. So there's a lot of ways to impact the legislative process, even if you're not yet at the point where you feel comfortable telling your story face to face with a member who represents you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosa. That's all really fantastic advice, and really is based upon years of successful advocacy that not only you have done yourself, but also many members of the community in passing all of these important pieces of legislation that you mentioned. We have about 10 minutes left in the hour, and we have a lot of questions to get to. And I would say the most commonly asked question is one that I'm going to pose to Heather. Sarah asked, what would need to happen in order for people to stay in their chairs on the plane? Peter asked something similar. Why can't aircraft be equipped with tie downs so wheelchair users can just drive their wheelchair right onto the plane? Michaela also asked, any progress in allowing wheelchairs to stay, individuals in wheelchairs to stay in their wheelchairs aboard the plane? There's a common theme here. Heather, what would you say to these individuals asking that question?
So I would say, so want to make sure everybody is aware of some work that is being done in that space. Certainly being able to fly from your wheelchair is a top ask. In most other modes of transportation, you don't have to leave your chair. And that's where I think we all hope air travel would eventually go. So I mentioned earlier the FAA reauthorization of 2018. And in that particular piece of legislation, we had a lot of disability provisions. And one of those was for the U.S. Access Board to undertake a study to determine if it would be feasible for individuals in commercial air travel to be able to fly from their wheelchair. And so in early in 2019, October 2019, the Access Board announced that it would begin this study, and then early last year began moving forward with that. So the Access Board is working with the National Academy of Sciences Transportation Research Board, and they have convened a group of experts to serve on a committee that is looking at the feasibility of this. They have had meetings, including last year during the pandemic, some of which are public, some of which are not, to really talk about all of the various issues that would go into place. Because we had, the first part, is it technically feasible? Because, everything in an aircraft is highly regulated. So the aircraft seat has to meet certain requirements. Even signs in the lavatory, everything is basically there for a purpose. And because weight is so important, weight costs money, because then it costs more money for fuel. So basically, if it's in there, it has to be, and it's regulated. So we wanted to answer the question of, could this be physically done and meet all the FAA requirements that they have for safety if passengers were to do this? So this group of experts, which disability advocates are not on, the airlines are not on, it's technical experts. The good news is that PBA does have 2 members who are scientists, and they are on this group. So they get both the issues as people with disabilities and as people who focus on science stuff that's a little beyond me. So they are looking into this now. They are required to do a report that's going to go to the Access Board and then to the Department of Transportation about whether or not it's technically feasible. And then once you get to that point, you've got, can you get the airlines to implement it? And quite frankly, once you get over the technical feasibility issue, the biggest convincer for the airlines is going to be, how many seats, if any, am I going to lose? So a seat is the only thing on an airplane that makes any money. And of course, although a lot of federal money, as we mentioned, has gone into airlines over the last year, they are for-profit corporations. So that's always their question, is what is going to be the impact on the bottom line? And we're starting to see some prototypes of seats that would allow people to bring on a wheelchair and yet not lose seats, if you will, but to allow fold up and some of the things like you see on buses, city buses. Maybe we could put that in aircraft. So the best thing I could say with this is, yes, it is being worked on seriously for the first time, by the federal government, and that there's lots of interest in this. And we're hoping that, if we were to get the Air Carrier Access Act amendments passed, that would marry up with a requirement to say, okay, we have the technical feasibility, how do we build it into, to cabin design? So stay tuned, there's more coming in the very near future on this.
Thank you, Heather. Definitely appreciate that answer. Dr. Rosa, a question came in for you from Stephen, and Stephen, thank you for the question. And he asked, do you have any concerns with emergency evacuation plans? As the last time that he had checked, these plans have not been updated. What are your thoughts on emergency evacuation plans?
I am, and I presume that we mean pertaining obviously to air travel. So I am generally concerned. I feel like as an empowered air traveler that there's a part of that is incumbent upon me to make sure that is addressed as I board a plane. And so usually as I transfer from my power chair, say a little prayer and say goodbye to it and pray that it emerges safe and well on the other side. Once I'm transferred to the aisle chair and proceed and transfer to my seat, I have a conversation with the crew about whether or not there is an evacuation plan in place and what in particular are their plans for me. And they're usually, my experience has been the crew has been very open. They've been very open to hearing what might work best for me within certain and from my perspective, it gives me a peace of mind knowing that even when I'm traveling independently, that I've done the due diligence to make sure that in the case of a worst case scenario, that we've had that conversation in advance and that there is a plan.
Thank you, Dr. Rosa. Absolutely. Heather, I wanted to go back to you. There's a couple questions. You mentioned the ADA, and you mentioned how there are some concerns with "quote unquote" reopening the ADA to add air travel into the ADA. We got a couple questions on why there is that concern, and wouldn't that just be simpler? Wouldn't it just be simpler to have aircraft apply within the ADA, and boom, that we're done essentially. Not essentially, but perhaps easier. What is the concern with opening up the ADA, and is that something we all should be concerned with in this case?
So I think there's a couple pieces to that. Number one is yes, there are definitely a lot of folks who have concerns about making major changes to the Americans with Disabilities Act. You've probably heard about ADA notification, which would require people with disabilities basically to, report to businesses about barriers they see before they can file a lawsuit, would basically take away the need for businesses to be proactive in doing access, because they know they could just wait for a person with a disability to come and tell them there's a problem and they would have a chance to fix it. So there's a lot of concerns out there about that issue. Also, just very realistically, it's probably no easier to put airplanes into ADA than it is to change the Air Carrier Access Act, just because the airlines are not looking to be regulated in this way, and they certainly would not go down without a fight. I think it's also important to know that if airlines were in the Americans with Disabilities Act, they would be under Title III. They are not. They're a public. They would be considered a public accommodation. And when you look at the private right of action under ADA, the only thing that exists is barrier removal. There are no damages for any discrimination that you face under Title III. Whereas in the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, because we're able to work with Congress and say this is what we hope would be in there, under that law, we actually would be able to sue for damages. So in some respects, if we were able to get the change made, it would actually be a better opportunity than you would have under ADA, just because of the remedies issue. Because the decision when ADA was made to only do injunctive relief, which is basically remove the barrier, was a strategic decision to get stakeholders on board. And so we don't want to go with that decision that was made years ago, to accomplish that. So that's why we decided, in working with our champions, that it would actually be better to bring in ADA concepts into air travel, and be able to recognize that, yes, this is a unique mode of transportation. It's international, in scope, and which is different than what we see in many other modes of transportation that are regulated. But we just felt that would be neither is easier, but we felt like that was a better solution.
Thank you, Heather. And I just have one final question for you before we close. There's a statement from Rebecca in the comments of, like I said, it's all because of the money. So we got a good question from Stephen about whether there has been any economic study done about the impact of making these changes, removing barriers for individuals using a wheelchair, because really you can think about all the economic benefits of facilitating travel for those with disabilities that could come about with this. So are there any economic studies on that question?
So that is a good question, and I am not aware of any studies that have been done on that. I can say that when the airlines look at this, typically they look at it from what is it going to cost them, and because they have the data and, quite frankly, the resources to pull that together, we get that kind of information all the time. But because the disability community doesn't necessarily have the resources to undertake something like this, and it hasn't been a requirement for, quite frankly, government to do so, I would say that we've more had to focus on, general studies that show the economic impact of travel for passengers with disabilities, and to show how that would then equate to more dollars. So it's kind of an ongoing battle, if you will, to show that the economics of this, while also recognizing that, you know, this is a civil rights issue, and that when you have some of the barriers that are in place, you know, that really is a sign. You know, it's the same as a sign to a person with disability that says, you're really not welcome here. We're not going to take we're not going to do anything that makes it easier for you. We're not going to remove any barriers. But if you can figure it out, or you're willing to take the risk, well, you know, come on aboard. And we just think that that is the absolute wrong way to approach access to air travel.
100%, Heather. And you know what, that is a fantastic note to end on, because here we are at 1 minute past the hour. I just want to finish with 2 items. First of all, there are many questions we didn't get to. Apologies, we had just so much to talk about today. If you do have any questions on the legislation, how you can support it, any of the specific questions you put within the chat, but we were unable to ask today, please do email us at advocacy@mdausa.org. We are here to answer your questions, and we are here to help. The second thing I want to mention is we got a question in from Sarah about how can she help? How can an individual in our community actually push this legislation? Well, for one, please join our network, because you're going to get our emails. You're going to get all the opportunities we're putting out there to actually support the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. Also, you can text MDA USA to 50457 to sign up for the network. And then finally, go to mda.org/advocacy. You're going to find there an action alert in our action center that facilitates you being able to send an email to your congressperson and to your senators, as well as opportunities to get involved there. So please join us in pushing for this legislation. It can make such a huge difference. A big thank you yet again, Dr. Rosa, Heather, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And again, appreciate everyone for joining us. Thank you.